Hi, I'm John Farrell from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in the United States of America, where they don't let you in or out of the country unless one of these is not expired. So unfortunately, I'll be delivering my remarks virtually today, but I think you'll be all right. The slides, I trust, are much more interesting than watching me. Thanks so much for understanding. Before I begin, I just want to give a little bit of background on the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. We've been at this work for over 35 years, and in our approach to energy, we see fundamentally a system in transition. That last century's electricity system was a centralized system where power generation was done at large-scale fossil fuel or nuclear power plants, often owned by vertically integrated utilities, and that power was generated at these big plants and sent through a one-way system down to the distribution system and then down to our cities and homes and businesses where people use electricity. And as the result of the coming of cost-effective renewable energy, that system is fundamentally changing. And that tomorrow's electricity system is going to be a distributed network of renewable energy generation with solar PV or wind power generated close to where we use electricity and often owned by the very people who are going to be using that electricity. It's going to be a system transforming people from consumers into producers. So let's take a look at how Ontario's feed-in tariff program is accommodating that transition. When we released our report in January 2011 on Ontario's feed-in tariff program, what we called its buy local policy, we found that there were about 43,000 jobs anticipated under the program in support of 5,000 megawatts of new renewable energy generation, about 15% of which was locally owned. So first of all, congratulations. We think you're off to a terrific start. But is Ontario's program worthwhile? On this next slide, I hope to give a little bit of context for asking that question. In conversations about the electricity system, we typically use the cost per kilowatt hour to evaluate whether or not something's worthwhile. If something is 10 cents a kilowatt hour instead of 15 cents per kilowatt hour, for example, we assume that it's more worthwhile. But all of the countries that are shown in green on this map have enacted feed-in tariff programs, and there are many others that have clean energy programs other than the feed-in tariff. And all of them have done this because the unfettered market for electricity without a feed-in tariff program doesn't provide the amount of clean energy that its citizens desire. And that's partly because clean energy has not been historically cost competitive with traditional fossil fuel or nuclear energy resources. So I think cost per kilowatt hour and that focus on cost per kilowatt hour is all well and good, but if that's going to be our metric, I think we're missing why it is that citizens have insisted on the creation of feed-in tariff and other renewable energy programs. The same sort of dynamic has taken place in the United States, where over 30 states now have renewable energy mandates because its citizens recognize that the cost per kilowatt hour is not the driving factor for the development of clean energy. With that being said, I do want to take a minute just to look at what the cost is like in Ontario, and obviously the biggest issue for many people is this cost per kilowatt hour. With that being said, I did want to take a moment to point out that Ontario is still doing a very good job of finding a competitive cost for its renewable energy program. This next slide compares the solar feed-in tariff contract rate in Ontario to the contract rate in 3 other jurisdictions that have feed-in tariff programs, 2 other ones in North America, and then, of course, world leader Germany. Now, what's interesting here is that when you adjust for the solar resource and available tax incentives, as are the case in the United States, you translate all of the prices into dollars and you normalize for a 20-year contract length, that Ontario and Vermont and Gainesville, all of which have solar feed-in tariff programs, have prices that are very similar. And obviously Germany is really an animal unto itself and has a price that is significantly lower. But ultimately the takeaway from this slide is that Ontario is competitive with its neighbors in terms of its solar energy program. And the good news is that the price of solar is coming down very rapidly. As I'm sure everyone is aware, this is just a good illustration of that given the contract price for a 100 kilowatt solar PV array under Germany's feed-in tariff. It's come down by more than 50% in the last 3 years alone. So Ontario is doing a decent job on that issue of cost. And I've already pointed out that that cost per kilowatt hour is not really the metric we should be using. So let me talk about the 3 reasons why I think Ontario has gotten it right in their feed-in tariff program. The first is the domestic content rule, which really makes the marriage between the environmental goal of developing renewable energy and the desire to have a real economic impact. The second is this community ownership element, realizing that the economic benefits from community ownership are more significant, are greater than your typical renewable energy project, and that it's worthwhile to pay a little bit more for that economic development. And the third benefit of the program, the third thing that Ontario got right, is this focus on distributed generation, because I think it really highlights the intersection of cost-effective renewable energy and the ability to deploy it in a way that is not only rapid, but enables community ownership and more local economic development. I'll start by talking about the domestic content requirement. For those of you who for some reason may not be familiar with it, the domestic content requirement in the feed-in tariff requires that wind power projects that get a contract get at least 50% of their value added within the province, and solar power projects get at least 60% of their value within the province. The next slide shows why I think that this program has been particularly successful already. In our report, we looked at 22 manufacturing plants across the renewable energy supply chain that were projected to open under the feed-in tariff program, creating 2,000 to 3,000 jobs in the manufacturing sector, which on average in Canada pays about $30 an hour. Now, I think it's pretty fair to argue that very few of these manufacturing plants were likely to show up without this domestic content requirement. And the good news is that the costs per job associated with this program, with the feed-in tariff program, I think are fairly reasonable. When we look at the 43,000 jobs I mentioned earlier throughout the entire program and divide that by the cost of the feed-in tariff program for those 5,000 megawatts of electricity that had been currently under contract or were in the queue for development, the cost was about $143,000 per job developed. Now that may seem like a lot, but when you look at across the border in the United States at a couple different programs, for one, the U.S. stimulus program, which starting in 2009 was set as its benchmark about $92,000 per job created or job saved. And that wasn't necessarily just in the clean energy sector, but really across the entire economy, whereas these clean energy jobs often have much higher wages. On the other hand, you have Ohio and Michigan that had specific programs, tax breaks, etc., for cultivating renewable energy manufacturing jobs, and they were paying upwards of $600,000 per job. So I think that in comparison, Ontario has done fairly well, not only in using its domestic content requirement to drive the creation of jobs, but also to do it in a rather cost-effective manner. The second element in Ontario's feed-in tariff program that shows how they got it right is this idea of community ownership. Through 2010, about 15% of the projects developed under the feed-in tariff had some element of community ownership. And under the new rules for the program, there's going to be a set aside, a minimum of at least 10% of projects having community ownership. This is unquestionably a good thing. When the National Renewable Energy Laboratory did a review of the economic benefits of community ownership, they found that there were job benefits of 1.1 to 2.8 times more jobs created per megawatt for community-owned renewable energy projects as compared to absentee-owned projects. When you put that in the context of paying an additional 2 to 10% per kilowatt hour for these projects, that seems like quite a significant benefit. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory also found that the economic impact from these community-owned projects is significantly higher, 1.5 to 3.5 times higher than for absentee-owned projects. So in terms of both jobs and total economic impact, a small addition to the price per kilowatt hour for community-owned projects, again 2 to 10%, seems quite reasonable in that context. Community ownership has another significant benefit. It actually helps bolster political support for clean energy programs. This is the results of a really fascinating survey that was done in Germany, comparing 2 towns both with a nearby wind power project. In one town, the project was not locally owned, and in the other town it was. In the town without local ownership, 60% of the residents had a negative attitude toward additional wind power projects built near their community. In the town where that project was locally owned, with that connection between the clean energy development and clean energy generation and economic development, 45% had a positive attitude. Only 10 to 15% had a negative attitude toward additional wind power production near their community. Given the results of the recent provincial election and how narrowly the feed-in tariff program remained alive, I think that this only highlights why not only the domestic content requirement and its focus on that economic development component and the jobs, but also the community ownership element of the feed-in tariff program are so crucial to maintaining its political support. In contrast, when you look at the United States and its renewable energy programs, in the last year alone, there's been a 10 percentage point drop in support for renewable energy as compared to cultivation of more fossil fuel energy resources. And I think that comes as no surprise when U.S. clean energy programs very rarely have explicit connection between the cultivation of more clean energy and those economic development goals. The connection in the U.S. is much more implicit, it's much more indirect, and I think therefore the political support is that much more volatile. So both the domestic content requirement and the focus on community ownership have really strengthened the feed-in tariff program in Ontario. But I think a third strength of the program is this focus on distributed generation, in particular because it's a very cost-effective way to deploy renewable energy. This first chart illustrates how distributed solar really has sort of a sweet spot at a medium scale size. That when you have distributed solar energy projects, maybe up to a megawatt or even 5 megawatts, but they can still be built close to where people use electricity and interconnect to the distribution network rather than the transmission system, they can actually deliver electricity at a lower cost than the largest scale solar power projects. The same kind of dynamic is taking place in wind power, where it's not the biggest projects or the smallest projects that are most cost effective, but again, there's this sweet spot. Wind power projects 5 to 20 megawatts were the cheapest to install in 2010. I think that dynamic continues, and it really highlights why a focus on distributed generation is a winning strategy for deploying clean energy cost effectively and quickly. Speaking of quickly, when we look at, for example, Germany's solar program, we have this incredibly rapid growth in the deployment of solar power in Germany, perhaps even a little bit faster than policymakers had intended. But one of the reasons it worked so fast or developed so fast in Germany was because 80% of it was on rooftops in projects 100 kilowatts or smaller. They were putting that solar up so quickly because they were doing it in a way that was very quick to deploy. When you want to build a 5 megawatt or a 20 megawatt solar project, there are a lot of permitting issues, land acquisition, a lot of development, pre-development that goes into the project. When you're talking about putting up a 100 kilowatts rooftop array, it can be done in a matter of weeks. And in fact, Germany was not only doing it quickly, but at a price of $2.24 per watt installed, cheaper than anywhere else in the world for comparable sized installations. So in conclusion, I would unequivocally say that Ontario's feed-in tariff program is worth it. The focus on domestic content and community ownership has really made the marriage between the economic and the environmental pursuits of the program much more explicitly than most other feed-in tariff programs or renewable energy programs across the world. I think that's the real strength of the program and will also be the source of its political support going forward. I also think that its focus on distributed generation, on the smaller scale power generation, and fast-tracking those projects is going to be a real strength in terms of getting to their renewable energy goals quickly and in a cost-effective manner. I thank you very much for your time. I again apologize that I'm not available for questions, but appreciate the opportunity to present remotely. Thanks again.